Hello students in my world mythology class, people on YouTube. This will be a lecture on the mythology of the goddess Inana. 4 myths in particular: the Huluppu-Tree, the god of wisdom or Enki, the sacred marriage or the courtship with Inana and Dumuzi, and the famous myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld. This will be a redo lecture on the goddess Inana from one produced about 3 years ago in that rushed online during the COVID times. I lost the stems for that lecture, so I wasn't able to turn down the overly loud music at times, and as YouTube commenters didn't fail to remind me, I pronounced the goddess's name, Inanna, with the Spanish or Mexican rolling N, Inana. Unforgivable. I guess it's because I'm half Argentinian. In any case, a lot's been learned about the goddess Inanna since then, so this is going to be a bit more of a scholarly ride through these 4 myths, so I hope you enjoy it. Strap in. For those of my students who don't like reading on the page so much, there's also a companion video to this lecture where these 4 myths are read in their entirety by Moonshine Isodi. And I might recommend reading the myths first or listening to them before starting this lecture, but either way is good. So, without further ado, let's get going. The 2 most impressive mythological figures to come down to us from the earliest period of recorded history form both a likely and an unlikely pair. Gilgamesh, the hero, is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and Inanna, the goddess of love, war, the evening and the morning star, and a sizable number of holy May, which will loosely translate for now as powers or culture modes of early civilization. Both Gilgamesh and Inanna hail from or have a special relationship to the city of Uruk in modern-day Iraq, and they are sometimes allies and sometimes opponents, as we'll see. Piecing together Inanna's or the Akkadian Ishtar's mythological narratives from fragmentary sources written on cuneiform tablets in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian has been a long and painstaking process that has taken scholars decades to assemble, debate, translate, and retranslate. The Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer provided impetus for the modern vision of Inanna when he published Sumerian Mythology, a study of literary and spiritual achievement in the 3rd millennium BC in 1944. Eventually, this volume, and his later The Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, caught the attention of the gifted storyteller and performance artist Diane Wolkstein. Together, they worked on Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, her stories and hymns from Sumer, which was published in 1983. This was the first time that Inanna mythology, in a newly repristinated and widely intelligible modern version, reached a broader public hungry for inspiring information about this goddess. Although heavily interpreted at times and with somewhat of a Jungian and feminist lens, this edition is still likely the best place to start for newcomers to both the mythology and the spirituality of the goddess Inanna, and Wolkstein's stunning theatrical renditions of parts of Inanna's myths are now on YouTube. This lecture will focus on a summative engagement with this landmark volume, which Mircea Eliade once called an admirable translation, a great masterpiece of universal literature, and which another blurb writer declares this book is worth a tower of scholarly tomes. Along the way, I'll attempt to update a few of the details in light of some of the recent scholarship I'm familiar with. I'm by no means an Assyriologist, and we'll also be looking to another, more recent storyteller version of Inanna's mythology in the Italian publisher and great writer Roberto Calasso's final book. So as to the origins, evidence, and symbols for the Sumerian Inanna, she is best known as the patron goddess of the Inanna temple in the city of Uruk, about which we hear a fair bit in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and which was formerly a temple of An. Inanna's symbols include the lion, the 8-pointed star, the hook-shaped knot of reeds, or the doorpost, and her name likely derives from Sumerian Nin-an-ak, Lady of Heaven. There is evidence for Inanna worship in Sumer from the Uruk period, 4000 BCE to 3100 BCE. The famous Uruk vase shows men giving votive offerings to a female figure, beside which is Inanna's ideogram, the twisted doorpost reeds. A large number of seal impressions or cylinder seals from 3100 to 2900 BCE from various cities give evidence of cultic worship of Inanna. Scholars continue to debate how widespread this worship was before the Akkadian takeover and Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, sometimes also pronounced Enheduanna, who wrote poetry that increased her popularity as an imperial goddess. While fragmentary literary Sumerian cuneiform texts related to Inanna predate Enheduanna, copies of literary texts containing Inanna's mythology often date to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, 2100 to 2000 BCE, when King Shulgi, also a scholar, promoted scribal culture near the formal end of the Sumerian world. After this, literary and cultic evidence for the Sumerian Inanna continues, but more sporadically, often in Akkadian versions, and Inanna becomes increasingly syncretized into other goddess cults, after Ishtar, then Astarte, Ishara, Aphrodite, and many others. According to Betty Meador-Schung's at times fanciful but often plausible feminist vision, this goddess emerges to prominence and dominance in the context of the Neolithic Revolution. Sumerian settlements in northern Iraq may go back to around 6000 BC, like at Çatalhöyük, which is even earlier, and suggest a great household or extended family, including servants, workers, retainers, core social units that are larger than kinship, irrigation, food storage capacity, and graves of distinction. Sumerian material artifacts suggest worship of female and animal powers, and these images continue through the Ubayyad period and into early Sumer and subsequent Akkadian culture. When Inanna is associated in later cuneiform texts and iconography with the scorpion, or the first snake, or mistress eagle, all in Enheduanna's poetry, these may be images going back to Neolithic goddess worship. Temples became important centers for food distribution and formed the social and religious core of the city. As Priestess or High Priestess, Enheduanna and her predecessors may well have managed agricultural enterprises on the land around the temple. The term En may also refer to priestly management of the fecundity of land and the economy. All of these cultural and economic enterprises, known to the Sumerians and Akkadians as Holy May, are actually attributed to Inanna in the story of her visit to Enki's Absu, an acquisition of the May, which we'll cover soon. Sometimes in world religions textbooks, it's said that the earliest goddesses are associated with motherhood and fertility. But actually, in Inanna's case, the first goddess of recorded literary history, motherhood barely figures, and she's more often a goddess of social organization, of war, as well as a patron of the crafts and the arts. In any case, any high priestess of Inanna, such as Enheduanna, likely experienced considerable economic independence, could make loans, and had administrative oversight. The temple employed many in the city, and priestesses may have ruled over the prosperity and the abundance of the village in multiple social functions. Here you see the Sumerian genealogy or Sumerian pantheon as reproduced in the Wolkstein and Cramer edition. Just a quick run through before looking at the specifics. Ki or Urash is the earth goddess mother, and her union with An, the sky god, produces Enlil, the air or storm or thunder god, who's normally the king of the pantheon. Enlil's union with Ninlil produces Nana, the moon god, and Nana and Ningal, the moon goddess, are together the parents of Inanna and also Utu, the sun god. Notice that in this pantheon, An also pairs with Namu, the goddess of the watery deep, and the son of this union is Enki, the god of wisdom or the god of flowing sweet water, whose city is Eridu. Enki often figures as a marginal or trickster figure, very often subverting and sometimes vying for power with Enlil, which makes sense on this genealogy. At this point, we notice that Enki couples with Ningikuga, the reed lady, and that is how Ningal is born, the moon goddess. So although Enki is sometimes called, misleadingly, Inanna's uncle, on this genealogy, Enki is as much grandfather to Inanna as is Enlil. And as it turns out, he's a much more supportive grandfather than Enlil. While Inanna is said to have two sons in a few fragmentary myths, such as the Descent, Shara, and Lulal, it may be that these are sons only in the proverbial sense, since Shara seems to be her hairdresser, and Lulal her shield-bearer, making them more like sukals or servants. Let's go into each half of the genealogy now in just a bit more detail. While the convention in Sumerian literature is to describe close male-female relatives as brothers and sisters, strictly speaking, Inanna and Gilgamesh are second cousins. Inanna's immediate parents again are Nana, the moon god, and Ningal, the moon goddess, and her brother is Utu, the sun god, who is especially worshipped at Sippar. Although less bright than her brother Utu, Inanna's association with the morning and the evening star, the planet Venus, already suggests for her a liminal or transitional status between lunar and solar, night and day, darkness and light, a goddess of love, or maybe twilight. Her grandfather on her father's side is Enlil, the air and storm god and king of the pantheon. Inanna's grandfather on her mother's side is Enki, god of wisdom and flowing sweet water. This double heritage from Enlil and from Enki is so very potent because it means that Inanna claims descent and inheritance not only from the union of sky and earth, Ki or Urash, but also through Enki, the union of sky and Namu, the watery deep. In literary and religious texts, her father figures may include Nanna, Enlil, Enki, and An, while her mother figures include Ningal, Ninlil, Ki or Urash, Ningikuga, and Namu. Inanna is the most attested and powerful Sumerian and Akkadian goddess. Quite simply, the greatest of female Anuna, or Anunnaki, meaning great gods, in Sumer, Akkad, and beyond. She will come to preside over and claim residence of what was formerly An's most traditional temple in Uruk, and become the city's preeminent popular deity. That her grandfather is Enki, called Ea, in the Akkadian period, proves to be decisive in her mythology, both in her rise to power and in her rescue from the netherworld. Important to note is that she's also of the same generation in terms of myths of succession as Dumuzi, here a full god, and Geshtinana, his sister, as well as Gilgamesh. Remember this later. Ereshkigal is called Inanna's older sister in the descent myth, but we lack her genealogy. So let's talk just a bit about the relation of Inanna and Ishtar before getting into the myths themselves. Certainly, the most important event in Inanna's mythological itinerary occurs in the 24th to 23rd century BCE, when the first self-named author, Enheduanna, and priestess, or a high priestess of Ur, and daughter of the Akkadian conqueror Sargon the Great, fused attributes of the Akkadian Ishtar, especially her warlike attributes, with the Inanna of ancient Sumer. In a follow-up lecture to this series, we will explore Enheduanna's literary and spiritual legacy, her adoption and transformation of the goddess Inanna. In this lecture, as introduction, let's stick to Inanna's myth cycle as reconstructed from literary tablets not attributed to Enheduanna. We're lucky to live in an era when the world's leading experts are often on YouTube. See Ronald Hutton's eloquent lecture, Ancient Goddesses of Sex and War, which begins from the famous proposal of Thorkild Jakobsen on how the syncretism of Inanna Ishtar took place. On this narrative, Inanna begins as a goddess who protects the agricultural storehouse, a barn goddess, and later becomes a goddess of rain and thunderstorms, fertility. This original function was underlined by marrying Inanna to Dumuzi, who, quote, generated farm produce, but Inanna then looked after it, the perfect divine economic partnership. The first religious rites to her seem to be dedicated to thanking Inanna Dumuzi for their bounty and encouraging them to provide more and better. Thus Hutton and Jakobsen on the 4th to 3rd millennium BCE. Hutton also points out how Inanna's association with thunderstorms is likely what started her warlike associations with the planet Venus. Quote, when she rose in the morning, she called soldiers to arms, and in the evening, she called lovers to each other's arms. This was a process of accretion. Ishtar was the main Akkadian goddess who became syncretized or merged with Inanna after the conquest occurred. So let's now look to Inanna's first myth, the Huluppu-Tree tale. The textual issue here is that Wolkstein doesn't really tell us that this is where she's getting Inanna's Annunciation or initiation myth. That is from Tablet 12 of an earlier Sumerian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So let's talk a little bit about Tablet 12. Scholars have never been quite sure what to make of it, since its narrative is difficult to place in both the Old Akkadian and Standard Babylonian versions of Gilgamesh's epic. It just doesn't fit very well into the plot. While it appears in all scholarly editions of the epic, it is omitted from most of the popular editions, from Stephen Mitchell to Sophus Hella. Given the hostile relationship between Gilgamesh and Ishtar, or Inanna, in Book 6 of the Standard Version, it does seem an appropriate irony that this outlier Sumerian Gilgamesh provides the framework for what we know or can reconstruct about Inanna's earliest mythology, and her annunciation as the goddess and provider for the city of Uruk. Gilgamesh in this Sumerian version is written as Bilgamesh, and a related tablet, also in Sumerian, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, contains an earlier version of Book 6 of the Standard Version. Also in that version, the raging discord between Gilgamesh and Inanna, while present, is less brutal than in later versions. Yes, Inanna does propose to Gilgamesh, and yes, Gilgamesh rejects her advances, but he does so more respectfully. Quote, "O Lady Inanna, you must not block my path. Let me catch wild bulls in the mountains. Let me fill your folds. Let me fill with silver and carnelian." While a conflict of intent certainly features in the Sumerian versions, the outcome of slaying the Bull of Heaven is more conciliatory. The Bull of Heaven being slain, "O holy Inanna, sweet is your praise," are the concluding lines. While it's hard to draw firm conclusions about the different ways that Inanna and Gilgamesh were conceptualized in their relationship from these earlier Sumerian versions to later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, it does seem that the drift of the culture overall and of Gilgamesh's epic is towards increasing patriarchalization and increasing levels of misogyny and disrespect shown to this goddess. In the Sumerian versions, Gilgamesh and Inanna are often in conflict, but the conflict is far less vitriolic, and there are many more instances of cooperation. Tablet 12 of the Sumerian Gilgamesh begins with what's sometimes called the prologue, and according to Wolkstein and other scholars, it's one of the most important sources we have for the Sumerian cosmogony, or cosmology. Let's hear it now in the Wolkstein translation. "In the first days, in the very first days, in the first nights, in the very first nights, in the first years, in the very first years, in the first days when everything needed was brought into being, in the first days when everything needed was properly nourished, when bread was baked in the shrines of the land, and the bread was tasted in the homes of the land, when heaven had moved away from earth, and the earth had separated from the heaven, and the name of man was fixed, when the sky god An had carried off the heavens, and the air god Enlil had carried off the earth, when the queen of the great below, Ereshkigal, was given the underworld for her domain, he set sail, the father set sail. Enki, the god of wisdom, set sail for the underworld. Small windstones were tossed up against him. Large hailstones were hurled up against him. Like onrushing turtles, they charged the keel of Enki's boat. The waters of the sea devoured the bow of his boat like wolves. The waters of the sea struck the stern of his boat like lions. So how should we understand and situate this Sumerian cosmology? At the beginning of Tablet 12. The Benjamin Foster Norton Critical Edition calls this cosmological prologue a tempest. The Andrew George Penguin Edition notes that it was Schaeffer's 1963 doctoral dissertation that did the grunt work to give us this tablet in its current form. George and Foster are clear in their translations that the underworld was a dowry gift to Ereshkigal, in marriage to whom we are less certain, but likely Nergal, based on later myths featuring Ereshkigal. An, Enlil, and Ereshkigal are here the presiding gods of heaven, earth, and the underworld. An carries off the heavens, Enlil carries off the earth. This leaves only the underworld for the feminine principle. The underworld, or Kur, or netherworld, is a remnant or leftover that nobody wants or can deal with, though dressed up as a dowry gift. Note how sky and earth are masculine on this conception, while only the underworld is feminine or chthonic, which underlies the predominantly patriarchal character of the Sumerian pantheon, and perhaps also Inanna's anomalous status. Samuel Kramer, in his Epilogue commentary to the Wolkstein edition, seems content to introduce the Sumerians, their history, their literature, their culture, and to speak of his role in the reconstruction of the final version of the Descent tale. Kramer also worked a lot on Tablet 12 while it was still being pieced together. This is a pretty hands-off approach. Given his status as a philologist, and may indicate his trust in his storyteller. Wolkstein's commentary begins by noting the frequent use in Sumerian literature of repetition, slow, studied, and hypnotic. The timeless realm of the gods, the soul, and the origins of life are the themes of Inanna's myth cycle. Now, scholars do not agree on the exact dating of Tablet 12 of the Sumerian Gilgamesh, but most say it could have been written as early as the 21st century BCE and may contain mythic images that go further back to the 3rd millennium BCE. The themes of the prologue are nature's growth and processes of transformation, the emergence of natural law, marked by the separation of earth and heaven, and the emergence of human nature within the cosmic order established and distributed by the gods. According to Wolkstein, in lines 1 to 3, the story of creation develops natural processes set into time. In lines 4 to 7, life's vital aspects are brought forth and nourished. In lines 8 to 9, the oneness of the world is divided. With the 10th line, and the name of man was fixed, consciousness, artifice, effort, and intention, also language and holy naming begins. What follows is the distribution of divine powers and cosmic realms. An claims heaven, Enlil the earth, and Ereshkigal is given the underworld. This introduces, although subtly, the themes of death and of evil, which guide the rest of the prologue. Quote from Wolkstein, "The flow of creation is brought to a halt, for though man's name has been fixed, what purpose is there in life and awareness, if all is to be undone in the house of decay? Who will attempt to understand death and thus find meaning in life?" Obviously, Gilgamesh is one who makes such an attempt. Father Enki, the god of wisdom, might be introduced here in the prologue as a first solution to the problem of death. The first shamanic descent is Enki's, when he sets sail to the underworld, only to be assaulted by stones and animal spirits, battered and bruised. What is the purpose of Enki's descent? We are not told. Is it out of a sense of injustice or unfairness for Ereshkigal's fate? Or is it to be the first god to conquer the underworld himself? We are not told. Wolkstein reads this scene psychologically as a battle between conscious and unconscious forces, male and female, Enki and Ereshkigal. Since the forces are equal, no resolution can be given without a synthesis. Quote, "From the encounter of the god of wisdom and the queen of the underworld, a tree comes into existence." This ends the prologue and begins Inanna's own tale. Without the cosmology, no tree. And so the tale continues with the emergence of the Huluppu-Tree and what appears to be a young woman, Inana. As Enki is attempting to descend into the underworld, a tempest is created, we could say. At that time, a tree, a single tree, a Huluppu-Tree, was planted by the banks of the Euphrates. The tree was nurtured by the waters of the Euphrates. The whirling south wind arose, pulling at its roots, ripping at its branches, until the waters of the Euphrates carried it away. A woman who walked in fear of the word of the sky god, and who walked in fear of the word of the air god, Enlil, plucked the tree from the river and spoke, "I shall bring this tree to Uruk. I shall plant this tree in my holy garden." Inanna cared for the tree with her hand. She settled the earth around the tree with her foot. She wondered, "How long will it be until I have a shining throne to sit upon? How long will it be until I have a shining bed to lie upon?" The years passed, 5 years, then 10 years. The tree grew thick, but its bark did not split. In translation, sometimes the bed is called a couch. Now, we're not at all sure when exactly in Inanna's mythical itinerary and life story these events took place. Since the tale of Inanna and her Huluppu-Tree occurs in the context of Gilgamesh's Sumerian tale, sometimes scholars place these events after her establishing of the city of Uruk and after her acquisition of the May from Enki, but sometimes before. We'll never really know. What is clear is that Inanna's entry in this tablet as a woman who walked in fear, we might read pious, holy reverence or dread of the word of the sky god, An, her great-grandfather, and the word of the air god, Enlil, her grandfather, is stunning, perhaps on a par with Enheduanna's authorial I statements. And it is suggestive that an initiation or annunciation tale for this goddess is being told. So far, so good, and it looks like Wolkstein has hit archetypal gold. In her storyteller reconstruction, we might imagine her acting as something of an enchantress to Samuel Noah Kramer in his more stolid scholarly knowledge. He doesn't want the magic to end. He does want these tales to reach a wider audience. He may be racked with doubts at times, but Wolkstein always delivers. According to her reconstruction of the Huluppu-Tree tale, here we are meeting Inanna near the beginning of her womanhood, in the early stages of her establishing of her city. Hence the lines, "I shall bring this tree to Uruk, I shall plant this tree in my holy garden." Thus the Huluppu-Tree, usually a willow, although Foster renders it as a cherry tree, is crucial for the success of Inanna's rulership. It will provide wood for her throne and bed, which indicates the tree's critical importance to Inanna's queenship. The 5 and the 10 years in which the Huluppu-Tree grows up in Inanna's garden sound pretty promising, even prosperous. At this point, the Huluppu-Tree appears to resemble the biblical tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and may be its model. But then something tragic, unexpected, and unfortunate occurs. Then a serpent who could not be charmed made its nest in the roots of the Huluppu-Tree. The Anzu bird set his young in the branches of the tree, and the dark-maid Lilith built her home in the trunk. The young woman who loved to laugh wept. How Inanna wept, yet they would not leave her tree. Andrew George, Penguin Edition, translates demon maid for si kikililake. Following Kramer, Wolkstein takes quite a bit more liberty and translates Lilith. Unfortunately, this overloads the text with biblical, Edenic, and folkloric parallels in later Hebrew culture. It also makes it more enigmatic to modern readers. We will meet Lilith, Adam's apocryphal first wife, later in the course, but for now, suffice it to say that a Lilitu in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian sources is an evil spirit connected with mental illness, possibly infant mortality. That is, if Lilitu is related to Lamashtu, the demoness of infant mortality. You can check out Irvin Finkel's amazing lectures on these themes on YouTube. At least at the symbolic level, what began as Inanna's shining and healthy tree of life has by now become a darksome and baleful tree of knowledge or power. 2 trees in one, with 3 infecting pestilences: the serpent, the thunderbird, and the Lilitu. For Wolkstein, this is the moment of Inanna's alchemical nigredo, or darkening, dark night of the soul, prefiguring her descent, and the knowledge provided to her by the tree's sickness is a loathsome kind of self-knowledge. Hence, Inanna wails and weeps. The tree expresses her, quote, unacknowledged, unexpressed fears and desires. The time depth of this anima mundi image of Inanna's tree is difficult to place and understand. Mythic traditions the world over depict tripartite trees, often associated with shamanic journeying or flight, descent or ascent into lower, middle, and upper worlds of the order of things. Although Sumerian is not an Indo-European language, it's an isolate, unrelated to any other known language, Proto-Indo-European dictionaries often point out the ubiquity of tree images across descendant cultures, and they are found globally, usually with totemic animals associated with the 3 realms. What is distinctive about Inanna's tree is, of course, its sickness. Applying Dumuzi's functional tripartition, involving sacred, martial, and economic functions, it may be that each of the tree's 3 ailments represent a symbolic lack or functional deficiency, which sets up Inanna's heroine's journey. She seeks heavenly or sacral authority, foliage, and earthly sovereignty, the trunk, and providential control over the forces of birth, death, and emergence, the roots, the underworld, or Ereshkigal's domain. Although unstated in the text, the thunderbird parallels Inanna's fear of An, the Lilitu parallels her fear of Enlil, and the serpent might then correspond to Inanna's rivalry with Ereshkigal. Whether or not the text can be stretched in this way, it is clear that Inanna is often associated with serpents, and is the mother of the first snakes, lions, and eagles in other texts, which are also animals of the lower, middle, and the upper worlds, not unlike the condor, puma, and serpent tripartition that we'll discover in Andean cosmology later in the course. So what does Inanna do? For Wolkstein, the 3 pestilences, as mere images of Inanna's own fears and desires, cause the goddess to dissolve into tears at the realization of her own dark solipsistic cravings. But with the rise of a new day's awareness and consciousness, and after much weeping, she is ready to ask for help from her peer group. In her heartrending plea to her brother Utu, the sun god, Inanna summarizes and repeats the tale so far, emphasizing its importance. Quote, Utu, the valiant warrior Utu, would not help his sister, Inanna. And so, as the birds begin to sing at the coming of the second dawn, Inanna called her brother Gilgamesh. Again, the tale is repeated, now to Gilgamesh, the valiant warrior, Gilgamesh, the hero of Uruk, and he stood by Inanna. Unlike Utu, Gilgamesh fashions up his heavy armor, about 50 pounds, and sacred axe, 400 pounds, and moves in to strike the serpent who could not be charmed, thereby causing the thunderbird to flee to the mountains with its brood, and the lilitu to smash its house and flee into wild, uninhabited places, escaping into the open country, as we read in Foster. Gilgamesh then loosens the root and prepares the wood of the tree, carving from its trunk a throne and bed for Inanna, his holy sister, while Inanna makes for him a puku and a miku. Both the Foster and George translations agree that Gilgamesh only donates Inanna the wood, keeping some for himself. Since the publication of the Kramer-Wolkstein edition, scholars have discovered, and now appear to be mostly agreed, that Gilgamesh's puku and miku, which he carves for himself, are in fact a ball and a mallet or bat. Gilgamesh uses these to play abusive games with his citizens, humiliating them and riding on their backs, and this in turn sets up Enkidu's descent to the netherworld to retrieve Gilgamesh's ball and mallet when they get lost in a crack in the earth. It is unclear when in Gilgamesh's journey and rulership these events occurred. What is clear is that Inanna disappears from Tablet 12 at this point. For Wolkstein, Inanna and Gilgamesh are both in the formative stages of their development here. Gilgamesh acts as Inanna's initiator, bringing courage, decisiveness, and strength in her moment of weakness. Malevolent forces have been expelled from Uruk. Reciprocal exchange sets up prosperity for Uruk, at least until Gilgamesh oversteps. So despite the creative liberties and state of the scholarship at the time, we can see why and admire how Wolkstein extracted the Huluppu-Tree from Tablet 12 and placed it at the head of Inanna's myth cycle. Her interpretation of the Huluppu-Tree, what she calls a third approach, focuses on Inanna's psychic reality and comes across as amateur Hegelian or Jungian, a synthesizing of opposition or another perspective beyond duality and the synthesis of duality. Quote from Wolkstein, "The tree embodies the dual forces of the universe, Enki and Ereshkigal, consciousness and unconsciousness, light and darkness, male and female, the power of life and the power of death. The three kingdoms, the underworld of Ereshkigal, the earth of Enlil, and the heavens of An, are all represented indirectly in Inanna's tree, at a stage before Inanna has secured and harvested control and rulership of these three realms for herself and by her own power. Unlike in the biblical Garden of Eden narrative, which may echo and reconstruct this much earlier tale, here there is only one tree, a radiant tree of life that darkens as it becomes a tree of power. Rather than suffering expulsion for enjoying the fruit, in this case the wood, Inanna is sanctified and established in her holy queenship and provision for Uruk. With Gilgamesh's help, Inanna has succeeded in her first gathering of the powers of Ereshkigal and Enki. The tree has emerged, and two more myths will describe how she gathers more powers from these deities. The tree that emerged and was unmoored during Enki's turbulent descent has now been domesticated in Inanna's garden paradise, or Paradinos. After a period of world darkening and psychic upheaval, the wood of the tree has been shared with Gilgamesh, empowering them both, not unlike Eve's sharing of the fruit with Adam in Genesis 2. Wolkstein, quote, "When Inanna begins her rule, she will be sitting on the throne of the Huluppu-Tree, and her understanding of life and death, consciousness and lack of consciousness will be increased accordingly. Likewise, when she holds a man in her arms, the bed will murmur to them both the secrets of life and death, life and darkness." Not being a Sumerologist, I must say I enjoy these storyteller renditions that allow themselves to take a little bit of liberty with the text for the sake of a modern audience. Another such example, Another excellent example is the voluminous writing of the inimitable Italian author Roberto Calasso, recently deceased, in the final 11th volume of his novelistic retelling of many of the world's mythologies. Calasso places the Huluppu-Tree interlude and the Gilgamesh-Ishtar relationship within a different mythical chronology, and it's told by his fictional Utnapishtim character to Sinbad, his final visitor after Gilgamesh at the eternal edge of the world. Let's listen to how Calasso introduces Inanna Ishtar in this text. Twice Ishtar wept, the first time out of rage and vexation because Gilgamesh rejected her, the second time in her temple because the solitary willow she had taken from the Euphrates was all eaten away. Gilgamesh was present on both occasions, first offending the goddess, then indulging her, but as a brother, not a lover. And twice Gilgamesh wept, once because his ball and stick made from the wood of the solitary willow had vanished into the underworld, once for his friend Enkidu, who went down to the underworld to get them back, never to return to the light above, except as a shadow. Ishtar and Gilgamesh could be fierce opponents, but they are the only ones who are said to have seen the deep. The waters of Ea, Enki, such complicity went beyond hostility. Ishtar's throne and Gilgamesh's ball, which fell into the underworld and led to Enkidu's death, were both made of the wood of the same willow. No bond could have been stronger. So moving on to the second Inanna myth covered here, the Inanna Enki myth, which was originally edited by Gertrude Faber-Fluge and published in 1973. A literal translation can be found on the electronic corpus of Sumerian literature. Again, Wolkstein's renditions depart significantly from Kramer's translation in his Sumerian mythology. The opening lines seem almost too good to be true. Following upon Inanna's success in establishing her throne and bed, now, quote, Inanna placed the Shugara crown, or crown of the steep, on her head, assuming her role as queen of the land of Sumer. Wolkstein, as queen, Inanna is responsible to and receives her power from the resources and fertility of the land. With the Shugara on her head, Inanna goes to the sheepfold. Leaning against an apple tree, she rejoices in her own natural powers, her wondrous vulva. We're also told that the words for sheepfold, womb, vulva, loins, and lap all coincide in Sumerian. According to Wolkstein, in this tale, gone is the brooding, fearful adolescent girl of the Huluppu-Tree. Inanna has received her throne and crown. This story begins with Inanna delighting in her womanhood and wishing to test its powers. And who better to test her powers on than her grandfather on her mother's side, Enki, Akkadian Ea, that other great outsider god in the Sumerian pantheon. The first god who descended to the underworld, as we've heard, and who was instrumental in the creation of humanity, and who also warned Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, about the flood, as we studied in week 2, thereby saving humanity from Enlil's rage and destruction. A model trickster rebel god, like Inanna, we could say. So, in setting out her journey to Eridu to visit Enki, Inanna announces herself, saying, I, the Queen of Heaven, shall visit the God of Wisdom. I shall go to the Absu, the sacred place in Eridu. I shall honor Enki, the God of Wisdom, in Eridu. I shall utter a prayer to Enki at the deep, sweet waters. Inanna set out by herself. When she was within a short distance of the Absu, he whose ears are wide open, he who knows the May, the holy laws of heaven and earth, he who knows the heart of the gods, Enki, the God of wisdom who knows all things, called to his servant Isimud. Come, my Sukal, the woman is about to enter the Absu. When Inanna enters the holy shrine, give her butter cake to eat, pour cold beer to refresh her heart, offer her beer before the statue of the lion, treat her like an equal. Greet Inanna at the holy table, the tables of heaven. Enki and Inanna drank beer together. They drank more beer together. They drank more and more beer together, with their bronze vessels filled to overflowing. With the vessels of Urash, mother of the earth, they toasted each other. They challenged each other. Naturally, for a Sukal, vizier, or official attendant, Isimud heeds Enki's words. and unlike in the descent myth, Inanna receives fitting and respectful hospitality. The drunken honoring of the gifts of life and the earth continue between them. Enki, swaying with drink, toasted Inanna. In the name of my power, in the name of my holy shrine, to my daughter Inanna I shall give the high priesthood, godship, the noble, enduring crown, the throne of kingship. And Inanna replied, I take them. And it continues. Truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the holy priestess of heaven, the setting up of lamentations, the rejoicing of the heart, the giving of judgments, the making of decisions. And each time, Inanna replies, I take them. And it continues. Enki, raising his cup a second and a third time, a total of 14 times, in his intoxicated generosity or magnanimity, Enki gives Inanna so many May that she enumerates them all for herself as if to ratify a contract. Before analyzing the list of May received from Enki that Inanna itemizes, let's briefly summarize 3 interpretations of this scene, those of Sophus Hella in his edition of Enheduina, Roberto Calasso, and Diane Wolkstein. According to Sophus Hella, an up-and-comer in the field to be sure, having just released new and wonderful editions with excellent essays of the complete poems of Enheduina and also the Epic of Gilgamesh, the word May literally means to be or to exist, although it is used as a noun. May are the, quote, fundamental elements of existence, that which is, and are the province of the gods. It is by wielding May that gods impose their awe-inspiring terror and demonstrate their power over all cosmic and natural elements. May is even trickier, however, as the word can also be rendered as ritual, or it can denote any repetitive institutions that sustain society. Kingship, agriculture, metalworking, craftsmanship, and sex were all seen as May. Longer quote from Hella. The tale of Inanna and Enki tells of how Inanna stole a trove of May from the trickster god Enki by drinking him into a stupor and loading his May onto her boat. The May that Inanna absconds with include, among many others, joy and justice, honesty and lies, rebellion, kindness, awe and reverent silence, wisdom, the scribal arts, shepherdship, leadership, leathercraft and metalwork, the kindling and the dousing of fire, the making of families, strife and triumph, old age, weapons, various priestly offices, sex and blowjobs, the kissing of the penis, singing and musical instruments. All these were May, that is, practices which formed the fabric of the human world. Note especially how the May are treated in the story, as physical objects that Inanna can load onto her boat while Enki sleeps, almost like shipping crates. The May themselves seem to be silent and inert, but owning them bestows cosmic power. However, in Inanna and Enki, Inanna does not necessarily get away with all the May that exist. Notably absent from the list are aspects of life, such as medicine and disease, which were controlled by other gods. The list we find in this text is probably not a comprehensive enumeration of all the May, but only a catalogue of those that Inanna stole from Enki. And this is what makes it remarkable in Enheduina's poetry, when Inanna becomes queen of all the May. So let's listen again to Calasso's storyteller version of the Inanna-Enki mythos, in the narrative voice of his fictional Utanapishtim, speaking to Sinbad, his final visitor after Gilgamesh at the eternal edge of the world. Calasso reminds us whose bright idea it was to distribute the May among the gods in the first place, Enki's. It was an idea of Ea's, Enki's, at once delicate and decisive, to seek out the Anunnaki and share the Mays, the powers, with them, showing how and to what extent they could be used. All the Anunnaki, high gods or Nuna, approved, drunk on power. Only when it came to Ishtar, Inanna, was there some turbulence in attributing the Mays, and this was because Ishtar was the only one who could be everywhere at once. Other gods presided over single regions. Ishtar was imperial. She was present in every nook and cranny, permeated every surface. They called her the girl who laughs with a happy heart, but she was also one who fomented fighting and slaughter. No one could be sure what Ishtar would be up to, would be from one moment to the next. Her turbulence upset every equilibrium. When Ea shared out the maize among the Anunnaki, Ishtar felt left out. She saw that she hadn't been given a function for herself. She was sovereign, but without presiding over anything in particular. Now she was forced to realize that the only thing that was strictly hers was sexual pleasure, and even if no one was ready to forego it, that pleasure served no purpose. The gods shared out territories and governments. She alone was everywhere and nowhere. Rather than any particular god, she resembled the divine that embraces all and cannot be pinned down. Ever the conflict averter, in this myth, which Calasso retells from the Sumerian story of Enki and the world order, Enki quells the righteous fury of Ishtar with an old trick. He makes a double of Ishtar, who Ishtar must combat, Saltu, alike to herself in every way and guarding the Apsu. It seems Ishtar must have won this battle with her shadow or double, for Utanapishtim's narrative continues, quote, "Wrapped in a cloak only the gods possess, she, Ishtar, climbed on the boat of heaven and chose to descend to the Apsu to visit Ea. Many saw her on the last leg of the journey between Kulaba, her home in Uruk, and Eridu, where you go down to the Apsu. The Apsu is just above the underworld, remember. She said she wanted to speak, her alone, him alone, to Ea. Behold, the silvery Ishtar, my daughter, are the words many of the guardians heard Ea pronounce. Just before they shut themselves up in a room of the subterranean palace, some of the dignitaries managed to glimpse their passing. A dazzling vision, they said. Huge, luminous wings hovered over the boundless waters of the Apsu, opening the way for the goddess. No one would witness what followed, save for a few moments the servants who brought them food and drink. Exquisite, no doubt. They whispered that Ea seemed drunk. They hear him say over and over, my daughter, and the two kept lifting the bronze goblets. What did father and daughter talk about all day and night? No one can say. All we know is that Ishtar left laden with gifts, 105 powers. She looked on with a stern gaze as they were placed one by one in the boat of heaven. Let me list some of the most important to you. The power to go down to the underworld and back, the use of the sexual organs, the art of woodworking, the art of the scribe, attention, kindling fires, procreation, judgment, betrayal, deceit, black clothing, colored clothing, the banner, the quiver, the kiss, hypocrisy, the tavern, the song, treachery, pillage, the lament, prosperity, architecture, the oblation, deference, lying, victory, makeup. And these are only some of those 105 powers. After receiving all the May and still reeling with drink, Enki spoke to his servant Isimud. My Sukal, Isimud, the young woman is about to leave for Uruk. It is my wish that she reach her city safely. Inana gathered all the May. The May were placed on the boat of heaven. The boat of heaven with the holy May was pushed off from the quay. In her commentary, Wolkstein points out yet other functions and tales of Enki, perhaps the most versatile god other than Inanna of the Sumerian pantheon. Not only does Enki create humankind, he fertilizes and organizes the land and is the master of magic, ritual, and incantation. Rather than an upholder of the laws of the god, Enki is a mediator between men, the debate literature, and a mediator before the gods on the part of mortals, as we read in the Atrahasis hymn. For Wolkstein, Enki is ultimately the great shaman. His holy shrine, or Apsu, is where the fresh water and the salt water converge, the Tigris meeting the Euphrates at the Persian Gulf. In this tale, Enki, despite or because of being drunk, rights the wrong of the original distribution of May among the gods, of which Calasso spoke, and Inanna has already passed the heroic test or quest, the battle with her double, prior to her arrival to Enki. As Wolkstein summarizes, with youthful audacity, she boasts that she will bless Enki, the god of wisdom, but Enki refers to Inanna as the young woman and bids his servant Isimud treat Inanna as if she were an equal. In his hospitality, Enki is full of generosity and Inana is full of intent. Gaiety surrounds them, Enki donates, and Inana takes. Her wondrous vulva at the start of the journey has sufficient amplitude to hold all the May. Funny way that Wolkstein put it there. Perhaps we also learn much from this tale about what was required of rulers and priestesses and their administrators in Sumer. So trying to break up the May into rough groups, we see that Enki first gives Inanna priesthood, godship, and kingship, obviously the most important. And this is followed by descent into the underworld, an ascent from the underworld prefiguring the descent tale, and the art of lovemaking. Next, we hear about lamentations, rejoicing, judgment, and decisions, and these can include such offices as the scepter, the staff, the throne, and the shepherdship, the princess, the priestess, the queen, and the truth. All of the other May seem somewhat more subordinate and related to the human world, rather than its divine governance. Inanna brings all these holy May and more back to Uruk, that it might prosper. She acts as Enki does in Eridu, but for her own city, Uruk, where she supplants even An. Wolkstein notes that the ordering of the May indeed tell us a lot about Sumerian values. Service to the gods, the king, and the temple, and its servants are paramount. Later groupings of May read like subordinate hierarchies of the types of administrative duties required for well-being, flourishing, and the maximization of justice and equilibrium between human beings and before the gods. Mourning rites, festivals, law courts, urban versus rural administration, royalty and nobility follow and are then followed by even more everyday human concerns, such as proper law and order, song, the guilds, the principles of education, the rules governing animal husbandry, and a vast array of social interactions, moods, intents, or states of land use and human being, including war, art, rebellion, counseling, and peace. Wolkstein emphasizes in the donation scene, above all, the May that's called the making of decisions. This is a bit of a stretch, but psychologically valid. According to her, none of the holy May given and inventoried can hold weight without the decision to wield them, over and against the authority of Enki, who tries to retrieve the May, or patriarchal authorities among the Inanna, who are likely to be displeased with the range of Inanna's newfound abilities. It is this moment, according to Wolkstein, which perpetuates Inanna's decision to leave with the May in tow. Enki is read by her despite his regretful hangover, and sending of monsters against the fleeing boat of heaven as ultimately encouraging Inanna's initiative and independence. Enki's free donation in an ego-dissolved state does not, in the last analysis, diminish him. This makes this tale perhaps our earliest, or at least clearest, statement of gender and political egalitarianism. Why can't all the city-states prosper and rule together? Why do we need to hide knowledge or power or technology from potential political enemies? Yes, Enki's consciousness reinscribes a possessive, jealous, and controlling aspect as he becomes a dark shaman, summoning his occult powers to rescue the May, but this attitude does not last. Inanna's indignant defense and fight through her subordinates, especially Ninshubar, for rightful possession, not to mention the contract she itemizes, while childish, can be read as a recognition of Enki's dual nature and as Inanna's entry into that same domain of adult responsibility. The lines which describe how her maidservant Ninshubar defeat Enki's monsters is not preserved, but we receive a clue in her cryptic word to Ninshubar, quote, "Water has not touched your hand, water has not touched your foot. Without the touch of water, or semen," Wolkstein's gloss, Inanna's May are secure. Inanna's envoy defeats Enki's monsters in stages, 6 or 7 in this reconstruction, in order to parallel the descent myth. In any case, the sympathy of the poet who wrote these cuneiform tablets is declared unambiguously when Inanna returns to Uruk. Now, to public acclaim, yet more May than Enki had given appear miraculously in the boat, all concerned with feminine attributes or raw feminine vitality, above all, the art of woman. Then more May appeared, more May than Enki had given Inanna, and these too were announced, and these too were presented to the people of Uruk. Now, in the voice of the people, Inanna brought the May. She brought the placing of the garment on the ground. She brought allure. She brought the art of woman. She brought the perfect execution of the May. She brought the tiggy and the lily strum, She brought the oop and the mezi and the ala tambourines. Inanna spoke, saying, "Where the boat of heaven has docked, that place shall be called the White Quay. Where the holy May have been presented, that place I shall name the Lapis Lazuli Quay." Then Enki spoke to Inanna, "In the name of my power, in the name of my holy shrine, let the May you have taken with you remain in the holy shrine of your city. Let the high priest spend his days at the holy shrine in song. Let the citizens of your city prosper. Let the children of Uruk rejoice. The people of Uruk are allies of the people of Eridu. Let the city of Uruk be restored to its great place." As Calasso puts this scene, at last, the boat of heaven reached Uruk. It came in through the Nigula gate and was welcomed by a crowd who could scarcely believe their eyes. How could so many powers have invaded the town all at once, bringing such sparkle to life on earth henceforth? The mays that Ishtar persuaded Ea to grant her were not restricted to regal or priestly emblems. True, these were at the top of the list, but after them came other mays, such as the art of tying or loosening a hair bun, of sacking a city, or of starting arguments, or disguising oneself. What was it that held them all together? The list of May included everything that the world of light to which Ishtar was about to return must not and could not do without. It was the imperishable fabric of appearance, and from the beginning it included the capacity to come into contact with death and not to succumb. The May immediately before that was the truth. If even one May, no matter how frivolous or ferocious, were to be missing, then order in the world would prove inadequate. And in fact, order was always inadequate, though it continued to be order up to a point, until something broke and everything fell apart. Then wise expedients needed to be found so that everything could return to its proper place. This was the art of the gods, and Ea knew it better than others. So as we finish up now with the Inanna Enki mythos, let's remark briefly on the character of Inanna in the two myths. Different characterizations of Inanna emerge from the Huluppu-Tree tale and Inanna's visit to Enki. On the one hand, she's an incredibly resourceful and powerful goddess, a true benefactress, protector, and provider for her city. On the other, she does require assistance and alliance with male gods or mortal heroes, and is not above manipulation and deception, even greed, hence the enormous amount of bad press about her that you see on YouTube from certain Christian circles. Nonetheless, there is a strongly underlined dignity and strategy to her deceptions and their purpose, which is often lacking in later Akkadian sources. Inanna does what is required for the sake of her city and her reign, and she is successful in forging alliances as needed and in quelling diplomatic disputes. Otherwise, she could not have made off with the May against Enki's monsters. The end result is that her city of Uruk rivals or even exceeds in splendor the greatest cities of her day. This is Inanna's legacy and her continued relevance, a world in which women are in charge. Above all, in these myths, Inanna is the goddess of most every functional aspect of her society. We are even tempted to imagine that her temple might at one point have been the governing body, the administrative center of all aspects of civilized life in the city. Hail Inanna. So moving on to the courtship of Inanna Dumuzi, we can start by noting that this was probably the most heavily reconstructed myth in the Wolkstein Kramer edition. Wolkstein's textual notes describe how she created this rendering by piecing together different love songs scattered in museums throughout the world with Samuel Noah Kramer's help. Wolkstein then retranslated and ordered them so that the story would lead from the personal romance of the young lovers to the more public ritual of the king and queen in the sacred marriage rite. That this episode occurs in Inanna's myth cycle after her initiation or enunciation, the Huluppu-Tree, and after her acquisition of the Holy May, her visit to Enki, is again a bit too convenient. Now the goddess, Queen of Uruk, is ready to be married. In fact, Sumerian women were married well before the possibility of any such adventures as Inanna had. The shy, youthful, girlish Inanna we meet in the poem is different. Love and sacred marriage poetry are hallmark features of ancient Near Eastern literature. Sumerian and Akkadian courtship and sacred marriage, or Greek hieros gamos songs and love poetry, are probably a long-range influence on Solomon's Song of Songs, aka the Canticles, which sit uneasily in the Hebrew Bible. The influence via the Greek Aphrodite on Sappho's poetry is also strong. For a popular edition of Mesopotamian love and wedding poetry, you can pick up Thorkild Jakobsson's The Harps That Once, Sumerian poetry in translation. Samuel Noah Kramer's The Sacred Marriage Rite is still a good early scholarly read on these topics, but likely the best source for sorting out the literature pertaining to Inanna's wedding is Nisenan and Uru's Sacred Marriages. Wolkstein's reconstructed version from the Idun Dagan findings and others, various tablets mostly dating from the 19th to the 15th centuries BCE, is well done. One of the key tablets Wolkstein draws from is Inanna prefers the farmer. Here, Inanna is convinced to choose the shepherd Dumuzi, sometimes pronounced Dumuzid, over the farmer. Dumuzi is, of course, Tammuz in the Bible, or Adonis in Greek mythology. As Sophus Hella points out, older scholarship posited that these accounts reflect a real historical practice, including a sexual union between the king and the high priestess of Inanna. But no extant reliable references outside literary texts attest to such a ritual ever being performed, and if it was, there is little reason to think that it entailed an actual consummation. At least such is the state of the evidence. And at this point, alongside other references, Hella mentions this volume on the left, Nisenan and Uru's Sacred Marriages, which is the best read I've found on sacred marriages in Antiquity, and begins with 4 articles on this theme in ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia more broadly. The academic understanding of sacred marriage rituals began over a century ago from George Fraser's understanding of sacred marriages as seasonal fertility rituals that centered on propitiating and participating in the death and resurrection of a vegetation deity, e.g. Dumuzi, or also gods like Dionysus or Baal. And this understanding culminated within Assyriology in the works of Jakobsson and Kramer. More recent interpretation focuses on sacred marriage hymnal poetry as a ritual of royal investiture, whose purpose is to consummate and legitimize a king's rule. More broadly still, a sacred marriage ritual or poem might depict, quote, every imaginable sexual encounter between gods and people or between deities. Following Zimmerman, the authors Uro and Nisenan define a sacred marriage as any real or symbolic union of 2 complementary entities, imagined as gendered in a religious context. The purpose of such sacred weddings is often to emphasize a kind of union in various cultures and to seek to overcome the great dualism of human and cosmic existence, that is, the old split between humans and the gods. Evidence for sacred marriage rituals, often with a sexual flavor in Mesopotamia, go back to the early dynastic period, 2900 BCE, but much of the literary texts are from 2100 to 1800 BCE and the later Babylonian period. Kramer stands in the background of Wolkstein's interpretation. From Kramer, quote, and reflecting the older understanding of actual sexual consummation, it was the king's pleasant duty to marry the passionate, desirable goddess of fertility and fecundity, the alluring deity who controlled the productivity of the land and the fruitfulness of the womb of man and beast, end quote. Other, more recent approaches, how this is the poetry of the royal women, competing for the king's attention, or songs describing the transition of a young girl to a bride and wife. Although dated from the perspective of recent discussion, Wolkstein's interpretation and reconstruction are helpful to the beginner and beautiful as poetry in their own right. At the start, Inanna's brother Utu, the sun god, notices his young sister's readiness for marriage, saying, "Young lady, the flax in its fullness is lovely. Inanna, the grain is glistening in the furrow." The season is spring, a time of growing and blooming where lovers connect with each other and with the spring earth, irrigated with the waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris. Wolkstein emphasizes an incestuous undertone in that Utu's dialogue with his sister is quite sexually arousing, but also checked by the destined bond of this goddess with a mortal. Quote from Wolkstein, "Since Gilgamesh, hero of Uruk, and Dumuzi were both listed as historical kings who ruled in approximately 2500 to 2275 BCE and shared the same mother, Sirtur or Ninsun, they can be considered avatars or incarnations of each other," end quote. This is pretty heavy-handed, since the evidence for historical Gilgamesh, let alone a Dumuzi king, is scanty at best and can't be demonstrated from a king list likely colored by the mythological imagination. Nonetheless, the identification of Gilgamesh and Dumuzi can make some sense of Gilgamesh's closer relationship to Inanna in the Sumerian tablet of 12, the Huluppu-Tree, versus their more vexer adversarial relationship in most of the later sources. The idea that the sacred marriage hymn serves the purpose of a ritual of royal investiture, consummating and legitimizing a king's rule, is not inconsistent with Wolkstein's account. Indeed, she mentions it. As Lapinkivi observes regarding the Mesopotamian genre of the sacred marriage motif, this thematic element can be combined in two seemingly different ways in the tradition. Either we have a human bridegroom uniting with a goddess in order to bring blessings to the world and to himself, or a human bride, i.e. the human soul, who seeks union with the divine bridegroom. In the first case, the blessing can also be obtained indirectly, the two deities uniting in order to bring blessings to the king and the land. In the latter case, the bride may be impure at first, a prostitute, but through the necessary preparations, she attains purity and is ready for union with the divine. The union is often co-celebrated by other people, cult personnel, scholars, or the general public, in which case the observers and the devotees identify themselves with the bride uniting with the divine bridegroom. I see no reason to discount any of these elements in the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi. Across the long lineage of Sumerian and Akkadian kings, perhaps starting with Dumuzi, or Gilgamesh, who ends up rejecting Inanna, Inanna certainly had many husbands, especially in later sources. Her status as a nugig, or taboo woman, did not eclipse her positive attribute of being mistress over heaven. Also, this makes Inanna a lot like the Gnostic Sophia, or Thunder, who we'll encounter later in the course as well, and who is simultaneously a prostitute and a holy virgin. Thunder says in that poem, which we'll read later in the course, "For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one." Summing up Inanna Ishtar, Lapinkivi writes beautifully, quote, "Inanna Ishtar was a multifaceted goddess, consisting of all possible contradictory aspects. She was a heavenly queen, a virgin and a prostitute, pure and impure, a wife and an unmarried maiden, a nubile girl and a mother, a woman and an androgyne, a bloodthirsty warrior and a protector, merciful and merciless, a goddess of light and a goddess of darkness, a good spirit and a demon. She was the one who abandoned her heavenly home in order to descend to the netherworld, and who, after a period of time, was rescued from the state of death in order to ascend back to heaven and regain her original status." So setting up the descent of Inanna in Wolkstein's reconstruction of the courtship after a period of blissful soul consummation, a honeymoon fusion of sexual and agricultural prosperity, both Inanna and Dumuzi, perhaps newly divinized on account of his sacred marriage with the goddess, return to their societal roles. Dumuzi, taking on the prescribed role of father and king, asks Inanna to set me free from the obligation, that is, of making love to Inanna 50 times. And the new king asks Inanna to diminish herself to the role of little daughter, or little one, in relation to Sumerian gender roles for kingship. As Wolkstein comments, the quote, "intimacy and passion of their summary love is gone. The two are together, yet separate." This effectively sets up both the impetus and the outcome of Inanna's descent. Dumuzi, or any king, such as in other sources, Enmerkar or Ensukastana, may rise to absolute sovereignty through marriage to Inanna, but no king is capable of controlling her prodigious May as granted in perpetuity by Enki, or as miraculously created by her unique being. Farmer and shepherd compete for Inanna's affection in the love songs, but Inanna marks the moment at the dawn of written history when no man suffices to realize a woman's destiny. Attempt to relegate Inanna to the margins as liminal transgressor of the ordered rule of An or of Enlil, and Inanna will renew kinship with the wise outsider Enki and his transformative vision. She will return to the Apsu, or hearing place of Enki, near to the abyss that hearkens to the netherworld. Inanna has not forgotten how to listen in the way Enki does to all things, Through this near omniscient listening, Inanna willfully chooses to withhold the quote sweetness of her holy loins, and she will even choose war rather than become mere property or prop of any god, hero, or king. It is in relationship to Dumuzi's ascendancy to kingship for Wolkstein that Inanna stages her descent. From the great above to the great below. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, the goddess opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, Inanna opened her ear to the great below. My lady Inanna abandoned heaven and earth to descend to the underworld. Inanna abandoned heaven and earth to descend to the underworld. She abandoned her office of holy priestess to descend to the underworld. And this followed by all the cities in which she had temples that laid abandoned. The history of the discovery and reconstruction of Inanna's descent tale is long. Building on the work of many pioneering Assyriologists, it was Samuel Noah Kramer who gave us the modern reconstructed version of Inanna's or Ishtar's descent to the netherworld. In his volume with Wolkstein, he provides a short essay on the history of its discovery, but without much interpretation, continuing his remarkably hands-off approach in collaboration. He does write about the descent extensively elsewhere. Important to note is that many sources for the descent myth are written in Akkadian, in some cases up to a millennium after our earliest Sumerian sources, and of course there Inanna is named Ishtar. Since fragments crucial to the reconstruction of the Sumerian original were discovered in the ruins of Nippur dating to around 1750 BCE, we are justified in continuing to call her Inanna. After excavation, fragments were then separated in museums around the world and had to be tracked down. Quote from Kramer, then finally came the difficult and at times heartbreaking task of translation and interpretation. Like George Smith's discovery of Gilgamesh Tablet 11 on the flood and the Atrahasis tablet in the mid to late 19th century containing the earliest flood myth and the model for Noah, the publication of Inanna's descent was a major literary event of the mid-20th century. Other than Tablet 12 of the Sumerian Gilgamesh detailing Enkidu's descent, what had been discovered was nothing less than the earliest and one of the most detailed accounts of descent into the underworld and return ever told, a model for all future descents, or Greek katabasis, such as those of Orpheus, Odysseus, Aeneas, or Dante. However, here the figure who descends and returns is not only a woman, she's also recorded history's earliest named goddess. What this means for Wolkstein, and I tend to concur, is that the first battle with and victory over death was not Gilgamesh's, who fails in that quest, nor Enkidu's, who remains trapped in the underworld without a divine dispensation, like anyone else, or even Utanapishtim, since he merely escapes death and is divinized as an afterthought. Rather, the first battle with and triumph over death in our written records belongs to the goddess Inanna. For Wolkstein, this path of the descent is impelled by the earliest initiatory rites of traditional or tribal societies, and what this tale describes is that original, initiatory, labyrinthine, shamanic ordeal. The netherworld, or Kur, perhaps a model for the Greek Hades or the Egyptian Duat, is that realm from which, quote, no traveler returns. But Inanna is no ordinary traveler. She carries with her the May of Enki, the god of wisdom, a god uniquely qualified to rebirth life and culture from death. For Wolkstein, the descent occurs in Inanna's mythological itinerary quite a while after her annunciation, acquisition of power, and marriage to Dumuzi. It may occur in her midlife or menopause, although this is unstated. What Inanna develops here is the capacity gathered from Enki's Apsu to listen to the great below. Quote, in Sumerian, the word for ear and wisdom is the same, the ear coiled like a spiral or labyrinth. And Wolkstein goes on, the moment Inanna opens her ear to the great below, her journey begins. Yet although her journey begins at once, the way to the underworld is slow and laborious. To enter the spiritual realm of the netherworld, Inanna must give up her earthly power. One by one, Inanna abandons her glory, both in heaven and on earth. She abandons her 7 cities and temples. She abandons her worldly strongholds. This marks in the text what we could call 7 stages of preparation. Indeed, the most impressive student creativity project submitted last semester recreated Inanna's 7 most powerful May in a single body harness. Melissa began by pointing out the 7 May that Inanna is stripped of during her descent are the crown of the steep, the string of small lapis beads around her neck, the double strand of beads around her breastplate, the gold ring around her waist, her lapis measuring rod and line, and her royal robes. Inverting the stages of descent from bottom to top and modeling her interpretation on the Indian chakras, Melissa placed the crown figure at the root, and so on, to the clasp and beads at the top, representing Inanna's robes. Other than the word 7 having some connection to wholeness in Akkadian, scholars are far from unanimous in how to interpret each of the 7 gates and corresponding 7 May. As Wolkstein points out, it is likely that some of the holy May, such as crown and lapis measuring rod and line, are related to royal power and priestly office, while others are connected to prowess and allure. As Inanna departs, she gives her maidservant Ninshubar detailed instructions as to how to behave and who to entreat should she be put to death, indicating her cognizance of the dangers and even, perhaps, her visionary precognition of the events to follow. Quote from her, "Father Enki, the god of wisdom, knows the food of life. He knows the water of life. He knows the secrets. Surely he will not let me die." As Ereshkigal is double to Inanna, so Neti, though a male servant, is double to Ninshubar. After Inanna knocks, it is Neti who asks her to declare herself and her purpose, and who reports to Ereshkigal the serious threat to the realm. Quote, "My queen, a maid as tall as heaven, as wide as the earth, as strong as the foundations of the city's wall, waits outside the palace gates. She has gathered together the 7 May. She has taken them into her hands. With the May in her possession, she has prepared herself." As Roberto Calasso puts it playfully in the Tablet of Destinies, quote, "Inanna said she wanted to go down to the underworld to take part in the funeral rites for the Bull of Heaven, Gugallana, Ereshkigal's husband, whom Gilgamesh and Enkidu had killed and cut to pieces. But that was an alibi. You can't kill a constellation." Understated here, but if there is a connection between the descent and Gilgamesh, Tablet 6, this would make Inanna partly responsible for the bull's death, and the descent a family matters visit to make amends, but none of this is clear from the text. Wolkstein's psychoanalytic interpretation of the purpose of the descent points only to Inanna's answer to Neti on this very question. Why does Inanna descend? Quote from her, "Because of my older sister, Ereshkigal. Her husband, Gugallana, the Bull of Heaven, has died. I have come to witness the funeral rites. Let the beer of his funeral rites be poured into the cup. Let it be done." For Wolkstein, this is a truthful, sincere, spontaneous, and conscious response, but what it conceals, even from Inanna, is the irresistible, unconscious pull of death and the netherworld. Both the logic of proxy and the logic of substitution are already in play, since Inanna's desire to witness the funeral of such an impetuous, forceful, procreative god as Gugallana already plays out her other, unconscious desire to gain power over and knowledge of death by proxy. This moment also marks the first implicit substitution in the myth, since the only funerary spectacle Inanna will be privy to in the underworld is her own, at least until she is revived, in search of a substitute for herself. As Calasso frames Inanna's purpose, probably the best we can surmise as to her motive, quote, "All Inanna really wanted was to set foot in the underworld and come back. Then she could say the underworld was part of her territory. Only the rash and insolent Inanna could have thought she could go to see Ereshkigal as if it were not more than a family visit." When Ereshkigal hears of Inanna's intent, she is far from pleased. She slaps her thighs, bites her lips, and announces the terms of Inanna's humiliating ordeal and thanatophoric passage through each of the underworld's 7 gates, open only a crack. let the holy priestess of heaven enter, bowed low. At each of the 7 gates thick with dust, as Calasso remarks, Neti insists on Inanna surrendering one of her May from top to bottom. Each time, Inanna is taken aback, fearful. What is this? And each time, Neti replies with a formulaic response. Quiet, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They cannot be questioned. As Calasso notes, when at last Inanna entered her sister Ereshkigal's kingdom, she had no defenses left. No one knows what happened next. She reappeared, hanging from a butcher's hook like a carcass. Actually, the text provides significant detail on the throne room scene in the Thorkild Jakobsen translation. Having had the clothes stripped off, she was led by a man. Holy Ereshkigal she made get up out of her chair, and in her chair she, Inanna, sat down. The Anunnaki, the 7 judges, rendered judgment to her face. Their verdict was a verdict gripping the bowels. They cried out against her. It was the call for punishment. Killed she was and turned into a slab of tainted meat, and the slab of tainted meat a man hung from a peg. In Wolkstein's translation, Ereshkigal fastens on Inanna the Eye of Death, but Inanna's pulling Ereshkigal from her throne and sitting on the throne herself and the 7 Anuna judges are more understated. Jakobsen suggests the odd manner of Inanna's formal execution, quote, parallels fairly closely the fate of the herds of sheep at the end of the grazing season, the animals being shorn, butchered, and the meat hung in underground cold storage rooms. Since Inanna, in her relation to Dumuzi, is associated with the flocks, she probably stands for them in the myth. I've always found the most fascinating aspect of Inanna's descent myth to be the creatures that Enki fashions from the dirt under his fingernails, the Kugara and the Galla. Calasso's remarks on them in the Tablet of Destinies is underwhelming. Quote, naked, dead, so she remained for 3 days and 3 nights. None of the supreme gods felt inclined to go to her aid, except Ea, Enki, who quickly fashioned 2 demons to bring her water and wine to revive her. Or in the Wolkstein translation, from under his fingernail, Father Enki brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into a Kugara, a creature neither male nor female. From under the fingernail of his other hand, he brought forth dirt. He fashioned the dirt into a Galla, a creature neither male nor female. He gave the food of life to the Kugara. He gave the water of life to the Galla, and Enki spoke to them, directing them to enter the doors of the underworld like flies, which would make them diminutive, and then to sympathize with Ereshkigal. Calasso's calling them 2 demons with their water and wine appears to lay off from discussion about the nature of these 2 unusual creatures. I like to think of them as literary history's first theatrical performers. Jakobsen renders them as a myrmidon and a young elegist, 2 types of professional mourners, with the myrmidon, or Kukura, being a subordinate type of ritual personnel in the temple cult. These figures do appear to resemble the Greek Corybantes, or Curates, armed, dancing, or singing guards who help at mystery initiations. Jakobsen notes they are general performers of a variety of ritual dances, songs, and music. The Shang Meador points out that both the Kugara and the Galla also show up in Enheduenna's poem to Inanna, Lady of Largest Heart, where they appear as ecstatic ritual participants and wielders of sacred instruments, such as a mace, dagger, lyre, kettle drum, or hand drum, and who enter into trances. Both are part of a larger class of ritual officials in temple cult that might also include Galla priests, also of ambiguous gender, male prostitutes or hierodules, blood sprinklers, and the pili-pili. Such archetypes carry connotations of both humor and transgression, distorted, disgraced, or defiled, but they still delight the heart of Ishtar. Kur, a mountain, and the name of the underworld itself may also mean a small pile of feces, while pili-pili might mean someone always making pee-pee. Androgyny or gender transition is often attested in Sumerian and Akkadian myth. So getting a bit more precise on the nature of these mythical creatures, the Kugara, the Galla, and others, In Enheduenna's poetry, as Hela underlines, it is Ishtar who created a group of gender-subverting performers to serve in her rituals, women carrying weapons and men wearing female dress. Ancient texts describe processions in honor of Inanna in which the participants would wear female clothes on one side of their body and male clothes on the other. They would brandish weapons, which were the traditional signs of masculinity, as well as weaving instruments such as spindles and distaffs, the traditional signs of femininity. These groups were all engaged in a playful scrambling of what was thought to be typically male and typically female. As the Song of Ishtar puts it, their ways are different, their work is strange. Together with the reed pipers, the kulgara, the sag-ursag, and the ecstatics, or the changed pili-pili, are depicted as ritual lamenters. Inanna makes them weep and wail for her so that they exhaust themselves with tears and tears. While it is contested how to further distinguish these ritual actors, at least in the Descent myth, how the kulgara and Galla, created from the dirt of Enki's fingernails and given the food or grass and the water of life, instructed to descend to the underworld like flies to resurrect Inanna from the meat hook, have about them a quite charming, queer, transgressive, performative, and even Muppet-like quality. This is how I like to imagine them. Of course, a pleasant anachronism. As Thorkild Jakobsen puts it in his great popular work, The Treasures of Darkness, the two creatures find Ereshkigal sorrowing, as is her wont, raking herself in anguish, sick with grief for her little children who have died before their time. As Enki says to the creatures, the mother who gave birth, Ereshkigal, lay there sick with grief for her children. Her pure limbs no linen veiled, her bosom had nothing drawn over it. Her talons were like a copper rake upon her, the hairs on her head were like spiky leeks. While describing a mother's agony and pregnancy without issue, these lines, a bit less risque in the Wolkstein, also have a bondage boudoir flavor to them, alluding to Ereshkigal's famously compulsive sexuality. In other myths of Ereshkigal, such as her coupling with Nergal, she is presented as a licentious crone figure, not unlike the hags of Celtic mythology or Hebraic and Arabian succubi. In her myth with Nergal, her husband, she begs the gods of heaven, quote, "Since I, thy daughter, was young, I have not known the play of maidens. I have not known the frolic of young girls. That god whom thou didst send, Nergal, and who had intercourse with me, let him lie with me." Resentful and destructive, rapacious and consuming, Wolkstein suggests that Ereshkigal's one great craving is for her own sexual satisfaction. Her naked lust, loneliness, pain, and grief prove to be what establishes her unexpected, appreciative rapport with the Kulgura and Galatur. Mirroring the moans of the queen of the dead in her bedchamber or throne room is a risky ruse, but Ereshkigal is evidently gratified by the sympathy. Jakobsen notes on this scene, to find such sympathy and pity in her lonely misery touches Ereshkigal, as Enki had calculated that it would, and she asks who these kind beings are to whom she can communicate her heart's sorrows. In her gratitude, she promises to speak a good word for them if they are gods, to give them a blessing if they are human. A little bit like the scene when Baobo amuses Demeter in her grief, Ereshkigal's unloving, unloved, abandoned, instinctual aspects gives way to appeasement, gratitude, even humor. Wolkstein again reads the scene psychoanalytically, with Ereshkigal's insides and outsides as symbols of Inanna's shadow self. For Wolkstein, Ereshkigal's labor pangs are what call Inanna down into the descent. Her nemesis, Inanna, must die, but her resurrection leads Inanna eventually to honor Ereshkigal. So let's now look at Inanna's rebirth and ascent and the Galla. As Wolkstein puts it, once reborn, Inanna wishes immediately to leave. However, in the Sumerian underworld, while a record of each arrival is kept, no one has ever been allowed to depart. But Inanna's case is different. She has been reborn in the underworld. Therefore, new rules must be introduced. As the text marks this moment of substitution, no one ascends from the underworld unmarked. If Inanna wishes to return, she must provide someone in her place. Until the substitute is provided and sacrificed, Inanna will be haunted by the Galla, the dangerous and implacable demons of the underworld who refuse all gifts and act as escorts to the unhappy dead. A bit like the Greek baleful daimons, Mesopotamian Galla quote, "Know no food, know no drink, eat no flower offering, drink no libation. They never enjoy the pleasures of marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. They snatch the son from a man's knee. They make the bride leave the house of her father-in-law." As Calasso puts this scene, they told her she could return to the place whence she departed. She would be escorted by the Galla, 7 demons like sharp-pointed canes. But there was a condition. A substitute must take her place in the underworld forever. This being a great topic of Roberto Calasso, we'll read on here with this version. The first to come and meet her was the faithful Ninshubar, her protecting shadow. Bowing to the ground, Ninshubar at once offered herself as Inanna's substitute. The demons would have agreed. Not Inanna, though. She didn't want to lose Ninshubar's precious help. It was thanks to her that her maize were saved when Ea had wanted to take them back. The same thing happened with Shara, Inanna's hairdresser and poet. Aside, her son in the Descent, but almost nothing is known of him. And since Shara is said to sing her hymns, cut her nails, and smooth her hair in the text, hairdresser is plausible. "I will never let you have him," Inanna told the Galla, and again with Lulal, her shield-bearer, another son we know little about, except the text indicates he is also dressed in the soiled sackcloths of mourning, and is a leader among men, Inanna's right and left arm. Inanna couldn't do without these loyal supporters and their skills. Finally, they came to the great apple tree in Kulaba, the part of Uruk where Inanna usually lived. There were shepherds playing their flutes. Dumuzi was sitting, motionless, facing a large stage. Aside, on more spurious accounts, Dumuzi was indisposed with slave girls. Apparently unperturbed, how could he be unaware of his lover's predicament? Had he forgotten her? Inanna's eyes looked daggers, or fastened on him, the eye of death. She said, "He's the one, take him." The Galla quickly grabbed him by the legs. They tied him up and beat him. Dumuzi called on Utu the sun to save him. He slipped through the Galla's hands like a snake and took refuge with his sister Geshtinana, but the Galla found him and caught him again. He couldn't escape. Dumuzi ceased to be Inanna's lover and became her substitute in the underworld. Inanna herself had chosen him. Roberto Calasso also has some great ideas on how to understand the courtship scene versus the descent, which are a little different from Wolkstein's. On the courtship, he sums up, Inanna and Dumuzi's story had begun with a linen sheet. Small or large, it's something you have to have. Inanna's brother, Utu the sun, told her. "Right," said Inanna, "but it will have to be spun, woven, whitened. Who is going to do that?" "I'll handle it," said Utu. "And when I've got this wedding sheet," asked Inanna, "who's going to get under it with me?" "Dumuzi the shepherd," Utu replied. "No," said Inanna, "I don't want a shepherd. Their wool is coarse. A farmer would offer a lot more." But Utu talked about the shepherd's tasty cream, and Dumuzi was Ea's son. In the end, Inanna rubbed herself with perfumed oil and put on her necklace of lapis lazuli, picked up her seal, and opened the door. Moonlight flickered through the room. Dumuzi came in, bearing a bowl of thick cream. Inanna spread the linen sheet on the bed. This seems to be her one unambiguous moment of compliance with the will of a patriarchal pantheon. In the descent, however, descending to the underworld, Inanna threw down a challenge no other god had dared to make. But the result was her first and only defeat. Those 3 days and nights hanging ignominiously from a meat hook in a place crawling with feathered, dust-eating larvae amounted to a last warning. No longer would she be able to proclaim her unlimited capacity for expansion, but for the other gods too, her descent to the underworld opened wounds that would never heal. In the past, they had thought to fashion men as substitutes. It was a strategy that lightened their burden without requiring any great effort. All they had to do was kill a rather obscure god and mix his blood with some clay, as in the Atrahasis tablet we read last week. Now everything was different. If the gods meant to expand to encompass everything, they could no longer deny the fact that the underworld was beyond them. They could not cohabit with death and the dead, and this left them diminished. They refused even to talk about it. The Anunnaki realized they were only gods up to a point. Substitution had insinuated itself among the gods. It was no longer merely an expedient to make life easier and more powerful. It was also a breach that death opened among the gods. Nor did it change much that Dumuzi had to spend only half the year in the underworld thanks to his sister Geshtinana's willingness to sacrifice herself and substitute for him. Geshtinana was also a child of Ea's, hence a divine being. And Inana would have to acknowledge that the 105 maize she'd taken from Ea when he was drunk did not give her power over everything. Death was impervious to them. Something else was required, a substitute, a living being. If life were to expand to its furthest limits, substitution was a must, but substitution brought death, or rather, it was death that brought about substitution, whether as killing or disappearance. I find Calasso's storyteller versions, told by his fictional Utnapishtim Sinbad at the eternal edge of the world, to be more somber and sober than Wolkstein's retellings. Calasso emphasizes the ruptures and the ambiguities of Inanna's character and destiny, which cannot be smoothed over, while Wolkstein seems always intent to redeem Inanna and to pave the way to her final reconciliation with the gods and humanity. It is an admirable retelling and interpretation, but in the end, a little New Age. Two other texts, the Dream of Dumuzi and the Return, were skillfully woven into the Descent where it breaks off, and these texts do appear to continue the tale, relating how Dumuzi fled the Galla to his sister and was seized, bound, and killed, only to be reborn with the help of Inanna and his mother's mourning and Geshtinana's sacrifice. Here, again, weeping implies negotiation. While these texts merit longer discussion, they are more concerned with the mythology of Dumuzi or Tammuz and his family relations. However, it is Inanna who is given the most beautiful mourning songs, and who presumably negotiates and announces the outcome. The agricultural status of this myth, as etiological, describing the origin of the agricultural season, is clear. Wolkstein speculates about the psychological significance. Paradoxically, although Dumuzi seems to be separated from Inanna 6 months of the year, he is actually wed to her all year, for in the winter, as he rests with Ereshkigal, he is staying with the dark, instinctual side of Inanna. Not only is he to know the love goddess, he is to know the goddess of death as well. The myth cycle ends with Inanna's offering her husband to the hands of the Eternal, to death. Inanna and Geshtinana went to the edges of the steep. They found Dumuzi weeping. Inanna took Dumuzi by the hand and said, "You will go to the underworld half the year. Your sister, since she has asked, will go the other half. On the day you are called, that day you will be taken. On the day Geshtinana is called, that day you will be set free." Inanna placed Dumuzi in the hands of the Eternal. Final words are Inanna's prayer to Ereshkigal. "Holy Ereshkigal, great is your renown. Holy Ereshkigal, I sing your praises." Now there are several other myths and many hymns of Inanna, but many are fragmentary or of questionable value, such as her rape by and vengeance against Sukalatuda. For a more complete treatment of Ishtar's mythology, see Louise M. Pryke's Ishtar in the Gods and Heroes of the Ancient World series by Routledge. Of course, the most significant texts for the transition of the mythology of Inanna into Ishtar in Akkadian times is the poetry of Enheduanna, but we'll save discussion of that for a future video. Wolkstein closes her discussion of the Descent, and I'll follow suit, by underlining the wisdom of Inanna's decree. Inanna has survived the confrontation with her shadow. Although a perpetual golden age of agricultural abundance, prosperity, and felicity is not feasible, the annual renewal of life has been wrested from death. Wolkstein closes her volume with 7 hymns to Inanna from the Eden Dagan collection, all serving to underline her myriad achievements and aspects. Inanna is radiant, thundering, destructive, defiant, judgmental, kind, generous, peaceful, healing, erotic, decisive, discerning, wise, transcendent, loving, fertile, joyous, and ever youthful. Hail, Inanna. The Holy Priestess of Heaven. I say hail to the Holy One who appears in the heavens. I say hail to the Holy Priestess of Heaven. I say hail to Inanna, Great Lady of Heaven. Holy Torch, you fill the sky with light. You brighten the day at dawn. I say hail to Inanna, Great Lady of Heaven. Awesome Lady of the Anuna gods, crowned with great horns, you fill the heavens and earth with light. I say hail to Inanna, first daughter of the moon, mighty, majestic, radiant. You shine brilliantly in the evening. You brighten the day at dawn. You stand in the heavens like the sun and the moon. Your wonders are known both above and below. To the greatness of the Holy Priestess of Heaven, to you, Inanna, I sing.